Chapter 18. As Arthur ran, darting, dashing, and panting down the side of the mountain, he suddenly felt the whole bulk of the mountain move very, very slightly beneath him. There was a rumble, a roar, and a slight blurred movement, and a lick of heat in the distance behind and above him. He ran in a frenzy of fear. The land began to slide, and he suddenly felt the force of the word landslide in a way that had never been apparent to him before. It had always been just a word to him, but now he was suddenly and horribly aware that sliding is a strange and sickening thing for land to do. It was doing it without him on it, or it was doing it with him on it. He felt ill with fear and trembling. The ground slid, the mountain slurred. He slipped, he fell, he stood, he slipped and again ran. The avalanche began. Stones, then rocks, then boulders, pranced past him like clumsy puppies, only much bigger, much, much harder, and heavier, and almost infinitely more likely to kill you if they fell on you. His eyes danced with them, his feet danced with the dancing ground. He ran as if running were a terrible sweating sickness. His heart pounded to the rhythm of the pounding geological frenzy around him. The logic of the situation, i.e., that he was clearly bound to survive if the next foreshadowed incident in the saga of his inadvertent persecution of Agrajag was to happen, was utterly failing to impinge itself on his mind or exercise any restraining influence on him at this time. He ran with the fear of death in him, under him, over him, and grabbing hold of his hair. And suddenly he tripped again and was hurled forward by his considerable momentum. But just as the moment he was about to hit the ground astoundingly hard, he saw lying directly in front of him a small navy blue tote bag that he knew for a fact he had lost in the baggage retrieval system at the Athens airport some 10 years previously in his personal timescale. And in his astonishment, he missed the ground completely and bobbed off into the air with his brain singing.
Hey, Ford.
What he was doing, yeah.
I'm going to pause it for just a second.
What he was doing was this. He was flying. He glanced around him in surprise, but there could be no doubt that that was what he was doing. No part of him was touching the ground, and no part of him was even approaching it. He was simply floating there with boulders hurtling through the air around him. He could now do something about that. Blinking with the non-effort of it, he wafted higher into the air, and now the boulders were hurtling through the air beneath him. He looked downward with intense curiosity. Between him and the shivering ground was now some 30 feet of empty air. Empty, that is, if you discounted the boulders that didn't stay in it for long, but bounded on downward in the iron grip of the law of gravity, the same law that seemed, all of a sudden, to have given Arthur a sabbatical. It occurred to him almost instantly, with the instinctive correctness that self-preservation instills in the mind, that he mustn't try to think about it, that if he did, the law of gravity would suddenly glance sharply in his direction and demand to know what the hell he thought he was doing up there, and all would suddenly be lost. So he thought about tulips. It was difficult, but he did. He thought about the pleasing firm roundness of the bottom of tulips. He thought of the interesting variety of colors they came in, and wondered what proportion of the total number of tulips that grew, or had grown, on the earth would be found within a radius of 1 mile from a windmill. After a while, he got dangerously bored with this train of thought, felt the air slipping away beneath him, felt that he was drifting down into the paths of the bouncing boulders that he was trying so hard not to think about. So he thought about the Athens airport for a bit, and that kept him usefully annoyed for about 5 minutes, at the end of which he was startled to discover that he was now floating 600 feet above the ground. He wondered for a moment how he was going to get back down to it, but instantly shied away from that area of speculation again and tried to look at the situation steadily. He was flying. What was he going to do about it? He looked back down at the ground. He didn't look at it hard, but did his best to just give it an idle glance, as it were, in passing. There were a couple things he couldn't help noticing. One was that the eruption of the mountain seemed now to have spent itself. There was a crater just a little way beneath the peak, presumably where the rock had caved in on top of the huge cavernous cathedral, the statue of himself, and the sadly abused figure of Agrajag. The other was his tote bag, the one he had lost at the Athens airport. It was sitting pertly on a piece of clear ground, surrounded by exhausted boulders, but hit by none of them. Why this should be, he could not speculate, but since this mystery was completely overshadowed by the monstrous impossibility of the bags being there in the first place, it was not a speculation he really felt strong enough for anyway. The thing is, it was there. He was faced with the fact that he was going to have to pick the thing up. Here he was, flying along 600 feet above the surface of an alien planet, the name of which he couldn't even remember. He could not ignore the plaintive posture of this tiny piece of what used to be his life, here, so many light years from the pulverized remains of his home. Furthermore, he realized the bag, if it was still in the state in which he lost it, would contain a can that would have in it the only Greek olive oil still surviving in the universe. Slowly, carefully, inch by inch, he began to bob downward, swinging gently from side to side like a nervous sheet of paper feeling its way toward the ground. It went well. He was feeling good. The air supported him but let him through. 2 minutes later, he was hovering a mere 2 feet above the bag and was faced with some difficult decisions. He bobbed there lightly. He frowned, but again, as lightly as he could. If he picked the bag up, could he carry it? Wouldn't the extra weight pull him straight to the ground? Wouldn't the mere act of touching something on the ground suddenly discharge whatever mysterious force it was that was holding him in the air? Wouldn't he be better off just being sensible at this point and stepping out of the air back onto the ground for a moment or two? If he did, would he ever be able to fly again? The sensation, when he allowed himself to be aware of it, was so quietly ecstatic that he could not bear the thought of losing it, perhaps forever. With this worry in mind, he bobbed upward a little again, just to try the feel of it, the surprising and effortless movement of it. He bobbed, he floated, he tried a little swoop. The swoop was terrific. With his arms spread out in front of him, his hair and dressing gown streamed out behind him. He dived down out of the sky, bellied along a body of air about 2 feet from the ground, and swung back up again, catching himself at the top of the swing and holding, just holding. He stayed there. It was wonderful. And that, he realized, was the way to pick up the bag. He would swoop down and catch hold of it just at the point of the upswing. He would carry it on up with him. He might wobble a bit, but he was certain that he could hold it. He tried 1 or 2 more practice swoops, and they got better and better. The air on his face, the bounce and woof of his body, all combined to make him feel an intoxication of the spirit that he hadn't felt since, well, as far as he could work out, since he was born. He drifted away on the breeze and surveyed the countryside, which was, he discovered, pretty nasty. It had a wasted, ravaged look. He decided not to look at it anymore. He would just pick up the bag and then... He didn't know what he was going to do after he picked up the bag. He decided he would just pick up the bag and see where things went from there. He judged himself against the wind, pushed up against it, and turned around. He didn't realize it, but his body was willow-meing at this point. He ducked down under the airstream, dipped and dived. The air threw itself past him. He thrilled through it. The ground wobbled uncertainly, straightened its ideas out, and rose up smoothly to meet him, offering the bag, its cracked plastic handles up toward him. Halfway down, there was a sudden dangerous moment when he could no longer believe he was doing this, and therefore very nearly wasn't. But he recovered himself in time, skimmed over the ground, slipped an arm smoothly through the handles of the bag, and began to climb back up. Couldn't make it all of a sudden, and collapsed, bruised, scratched, and shaking on the stony ground. He staggered instantly to his feet and swayed hopelessly around, swinging the bag around him in agony of grief and disappointment. His feet suddenly were stuck heavily to the ground in the way they had always been. His body seemed like an unwieldy sack of potatoes that reeled, stumbling against the ground. His mind had all the lightness of a bag of lead. He sagged and swayed and ached with giddiness. He tried hopelessly to run, but his legs were suddenly too weak. He tripped and flopped forward. At that moment, he remembered that in the bag he was now carrying was not only a can of Greek olive oil, but a duty-free allowance of Retsina, and the pleasurable shock of that realization he failed to notice for at least 10 seconds that he was now flying again. He whooped and cried with relief and pleasure and sheer physical delight. He swooped, he wheeled, he skidded and whirled through the air. Cheekily, he sat on an updraft and went through the contents of the tote bag. He felt the way he imagined an angel must feel after doing its celebrated dance on the head of a pin while being counted by philosophers. He laughed with pleasure at the discovery that the bag did in fact contain the olive oil and the Retsina, as well as a pair of cracked sunglasses, some sand-filled swimming trunks, some creased postcards of Santorini, a large and unsightly towel, some interesting stones, and various scraps of paper with the addresses of people he was relieved to think he would never meet again, even if the reason why was a sad one. He dropped the stones, put on the sunglasses, and left the pieces of paper to whip away in the wind. 10 minutes later, drifting idly through a cloud, He got a large and extremely disreputable cocktail party in the small of the back. Chapter 19. The longest and most destructive party ever held is now into its 4th generation, and still no one shows any signs of leaving. Somebody did once look at his watch, but that was 11 years ago now, and there has been no follow-up. The mess is extraordinary, and has to be seen to be believed, but if you don't have any particular need to believe it, then don't go and look, because you won't enjoy it. There have recently been some bangs and flashes up in the clouds, and there is one theory that this is a battle being fought between the fleets of several rival carpet cleaning companies who are hovering over the thing like vultures. But you shouldn't believe anything you hear at parties, and particularly not anything you hear at this one. One of the problems, and it's one that is obviously going to get worse, is that all the people at the party are either the children or the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of the people who wouldn't leave in the first place. And because of all the business about selective breeding and recessive genes and so on, it means that all the people now at the party are either absolutely fanatical partygoers or gibbering idiots, or, more and more frequently, both. Either way, it means that, genetically speaking, each succeeding generation is now less likely to leave than the preceding one. So other factors come into operation, like when the drinks are going to run out. Now, because of certain things that have happened that seemed like a good idea at the time, and one of the problems with a party that never stops is that all things that only seem like a good idea at parties continue to seem like good ideas, that point seems to still be a long way off. One of the things that seemed like a good idea at the time was that the party should fly, not in the normal sense that parties are meant to fly, but literally. One night, long ago, a band of drunken astro-engineers of the 1st generation clambered around the building digging this, fixing that, banging very hard on the other. And when the sun rose the following morning, it was startled to find itself shining on a building full of happy, drunken people that was now floating like a young and uncertain bird over the treetops. Not only that, but the party had also managed to arm itself rather heavily. If they were going to get involved in any petty arguments with wine merchants, they wanted to make sure that they had might on their side. The transition from full-time cocktail party to part-time raiding party came with ease, and did much to add to that extra bit of zest and swing to the whole affair that was badly needed at this point because of the enormous number of times that the band had already played all the numbers it knew over the years. They looted, they raided, they held whole cities to ransom for fresh supplies of cheese, crackers, guacamole, spare ribs, and wine and spirits that would now get piped aboard from floating tankers. The problem of when the drinks are going to run out is, however, going to have to be faced one day. The planet over which they are floating is no longer the planet it was when they first started floating over it. It is in bad shape. The party has attacked and raided an awful lot of it, and no one has ever succeeded in hitting it back because of the erratic and unpredictable way in which it lurches around the sky. It is one hell of a party. It is also one hell of a thing to get hit with in the small of the back. Chapter 20. Arthur lay floundering in pain on a piece of ripped and dismembered reinforced concrete, flicked at by wisps of clouds and by bits of passing cloud, and confused by the sounds of flabby merrymaking somewhere indistinctly behind him. There was a sound he couldn't immediately identify, partly because he didn't know the tune, I Left My Leg in Joglin Beta, and partly because the band playing it was very tired, and some members of it were playing it in 3/4 time, some in 4/4, and some in kind of pi-eyed pi-r squared, each according to the amount of sleep he'd managed to grab recently. He lay, panting heavily in the wet air, and tried feeling bits of himself to see where he might be hurt. Wherever he touched himself, he encountered a pain. After a short while, he worked out that this was because it was his hand that was hurting. He seemed to have sprained his wrist. His back, too, was hurting, but he soon satisfied himself that he was not badly hurt, but just bruised and a little shaken, as who wouldn't be. He couldn't understand what a building would be doing flying through the clouds. On the other hand, he would have been a little hard-pressed to come up with any convincing explanation of his own presence, so he decided that he and the building were just going to have to accept each other. He looked up from where he was lying. A wall of pale but stained stone slabs rose up beside him, the building proper. He seemed to be stretched out on some sort of ledge or lip that extended outward for 3 or 4 feet all the way around. It was a hunk of the ground in which the party building had had its foundations, and which it had taken along with itself to keep itself bound together at the bottom end. Nervously, he stood up, and suddenly, without looking over the edge, he felt nauseated with vertigo. He pressed himself back against the wall, wet with mist and sweat. His head was swimming freestyle, but his stomach was doing the butterfly. Even though he had got up here under his own power, he could now not even bear to contemplate the hideous drop in front of him. He was not about to try his luck jumping. He was not about to move an inch closer to the edge. Clutching his tote bag, he edged along the wall, hoping to find a doorway in. The solid weight of the can of olive oil was a great reassurance to him. He was edging in the direction of the nearest corner, in the hope that the wall around the corner might offer more in the way of entrances than this one, which offered none. The unsteadiness of the building's flight made him feel sick with fear, and after a short time, he took the towel from his bag and did something with it which once again justified its supreme position in the list of useful things to take with you when you hitchhike around the galaxy. He put it over his head so he wouldn't have to see what he was doing. His feet edged along the ground. His outstretched hand edged along the wall. Finally, he came to the corner, and as his hand rounded the corner, it encountered something that gave him such a shock he nearly fell off. It was another hand. The two hands gripped each other. He desperately wanted to use his other hand to pull the towel away from his eyes, but it was holding the bag with the olive oil, the Retsina, and the postcards of Santorini, and he very much didn't want to put it down. He experienced one of those self moments, one of those moments when you suddenly turn around and look at yourself and think, who am I? What am I up to? What have I achieved? Am I doing well? He whimpered very slightly. He tried to free his hand, but he couldn't. The other hand was holding his tightly. He had no recourse but to edge onward toward the corner. He leaned around it and shook his head in an attempt to dislodge the towel. This seemed to provoke a sharp cry of some unfathomable emotion from the owner of the other hand. The towel was whipped from his head, and he found his eyes peering into those of Ford Prefect. Beyond him stood Slarty Bartfast, and beyond them he could clearly see a porchway and a large closed door. They were both pressed back against the wall, eyes wild with terror as they stared out into the thick, blind cloud around them, and tried to resist the lurching and swaying of the building. "Where the zarking photon have you been?" hissed Ford, panic-stricken. Well, stuttered Arthur, not really knowing how to sum it all up that briefly. "Here and there." "What are you doing here?" Ford turned his wild eyes on Arthur again. "They won't let us in without a bottle," he hissed. Chapter 21. The first thing Arthur noticed as they entered into the thick of the party, apart from the noise, the suffocating heat, the wild profusion of colors that protruded dimly through the atmosphere of heady smoke, the carpets thick with ground glass, ash, and guacamole droppings, and the small group of pterodactyl-like creatures in lurex who descended on his cherished bottle of Retsina, squawking, "A new pleasure, a new pleasure," was Trillian being chatted up by a thunder god. "Didn't I see you at Milliways?" he was saying. "Were you the one with the hammer?" "Yes, I much prefer it here. So much less reputable, so much more fraught." Squeals of some hideous pleasures rang around the room, the outer dimensions of which were invisible through the heaving throng of happy, noisy creatures, cheerfully yelling at each other things that nobody could hear and occasionally having crises. "Seems fun," said Trillian. "What did you say, Arthur?" "I said, how the hell did you get here?" It was a row of dots flowing randomly through the universe. I was a row of dots flowing randomly through the universe. Have you met Thor? He makes thunder. "Hello," said Arthur. "I expect that must be very interesting." "Hi," said Thor. "It is. Have you got a drink?" No, actually." "Then why don't you go and get one?" "See you later, Arthur," said Trillian. Something jogged Arthur's mind, and he looked around huntedly. "Ford isn't here, is he?" "See you," said Trillian firmly. "Later." Thor glared at him with hard, coal-black eyes, his beard bristling. What little light there was in the place mustered its forces briefly to glint menacingly off the horns of his helmet. He took Trillian's elbow in his extremely large hand, and muscles in his upper arm moved around each other like a couple of Volkswagens parking. He led her away. One of the interesting things about being immortal, he said, is... One of the interesting things about space, Arthur heard Slarty Bartfast saying to a large and voluminous creature who looked like someone losing a fight with a pink comforter and was gazing raptly at the old man's deep eyes and silver beard, is how dull it is. Dull, said the creature, and blinked her rather wrinkled and bloodshot eyes. Yes, said Slarty Bartfast, staggeringly dull, bewilderingly so. You see, there's so much of it and so little in it. Would you like me to quote you some statistics? Well, please, I would like to. They, too, are quite sensationally dull. I'll come back and hear them in a moment, she said, patted him on the arm, lifted up her skirts like a hovercraft, and moved off into the heaving crowd. I thought she'd never go, growled the old man. Come, Earthman. Arthur. We must find the silver bale. It's here somewhere. Can't we just relax a little? Arthur said. I've had a tough day. Trillion's here, incidentally. She didn't say how. Probably doesn't matter. Think of the danger to the universe. The universe, said Arthur, is big enough and old enough to look after itself for half an hour. All right, he added in response to Slarty Bartfast's increasing agitation. I'll wander around and see if anybody's seen it. Good God, Slarty Bartfast said. Good. He plunged into the crowd himself and was told to relax by everybody he passed. Have you seen a bale anywhere? Said Arthur to a little man who seemed to be standing eagerly waiting to listen to somebody. It's made of silver. Vitally important for the future of the safety of the universe, and about this long. No, said the enthusiastically wizened little man, but do have a drink and tell me all about it. Ford Prefect writhed past, dancing a wild, frenetic, and not entirely unobscene dance with someone who looked as if she were wearing Sydney Opera House on her head. He was yelling a futile conversation at her above the din. I like the hat, he bawled. What? I said I like the hat. I'm not wearing a hat. Well, I like the head then. What? I said I like the head. Interesting bone structure. What? Ford worked a shrug into the complex routine of other movements he was performing. I said you dance great, he shouted. Just don't nod so much. What? It's just that every time you nod, said Ford. Ow! He added as his partner nodded forward to say, what? And once again pecked him sharply on the forehead with the sharp end of her swept forward skull. My planet was blown up one morning, said Arthur, who had found himself quite unexpectedly telling the little man his life story, or at least edited highlights of it. That's why I'm dressed like this, in my dressing gown. My planet was blown up with all my clothes in it, you see. I didn't realize he'd be coming to a party. The little man nodded enthusiastically. Later, I was thrown off a spaceship, still in my dressing gown. Rather than the spacesuit one would normally expect, shortly after that, I discovered that my planet had originally been built by a bunch of mice. You can imagine how I felt about that. I was then shot at for a while and blown up. In fact, I've been blown up ridiculously often, shot at, insulted, regularly disintegrated, deprived of tea, and recently crashed into a swamp and had to spend 5 years in a damp cave. Ah, effervesced the little man. And did you have a wonderful time? Arthur started to choke violently on his drink. What a wonderfully exciting cough, said the little man, quite startled by it. Do you mind if I join you? And with that, he launched into the most extraordinary and spectacular fit of coughing that caught Arthur so much by surprise that he started to choke violently, discovered he was already doing it, and got thoroughly confused. Together, they performed a lung-busting duet that went on for fully 2 minutes before Arthur managed to cough and splutter to a halt. So invigorating, said the little man, panting and wiping tears from his eyes. What an exciting life you must lead. Thank you very much. He shook Arthur warmly by the hand and walked off into the crowd. Arthur shook his head in astonishment. A youngish-looking man came up to him, an aggressive-looking type with a hook mouth, a lantern nose, and small, beady little cheekbones. He was wearing black trousers, a black silk shirt open to what was presumably his navel, though Arthur had learned never to make assumptions about the anatomies of the sort of people he tended to meet these days, and had all sorts of nasty, dangly gold things hanging around his neck. He carried something in a black bag and clearly wanted people to notice that he didn't want them to notice it. Hey, did I hear you say your name just now? He said. This was one of the many things Arthur had told the enthusiastic little man. Yes, it's Arthur Dent. The man seemed to be dancing slightly to some rhythm other than any of the several that the band was grimly pushing out. Yeah, he said, only there was a man in the mountain wanted to see you. I met him. Yeah, only he seemed pretty anxious about it, you know. Yes, I met him. Yeah, well, I think you should know that. I do. I met him. The man paused to chew a little gum. Then he clapped Arthur on the back. Okay, he said. All right, I'm just telling you, right? Good night. Good luck. Win awards. What? Said Arthur, who was beginning to flounder seriously at this point. Whatever. Do what you do. Do it well. He made a sort of clucking noise with whatever he was chewing on, and then some vaguely dynamic gesture. Why? Said Arthur. Do it badly, said the man. Who cares? Who gives a what? The blood suddenly seemed to pump angrily into the man's face, and he started to shout. Why not go mad? He said. Go away, get off my back, will you, guy? Just zark off. Okay, I'm going, said Arthur hurriedly. It's been real. The man gave a sharp wave and disappeared off into the throng. What was that all about? Asked Arthur to a girl he found standing beside him. Why did he tell me to win awards? Just showbiz talk, answered the girl. He just won an award at the annual Ursa Minor Alpha Recreational Illusions Institute's awards ceremony, and he was hoping to be able to pass it off lightly, only you didn't mention it, so he couldn't. Oh, said Arthur. Oh, well, I'm sorry I didn't. What was it for? The most gratuitous use of the word Belgium in a serious screenplay. It's very prestigious. The most gratuitous use of which word? Asked Arthur with a determined attempt to keep his brain in neutral. Belgium, said the girl. I hardly like to say it. Belgium, exclaimed Arthur. A drunken seven-toed sloth staggered past, gawked at the word, and threw itself backward at a blurry-eyed pterodactyl, roaring with displeasure. Are we talking, said Arthur, about the very flat country with all the EEC and the fog? What? Said the girl. Belgium, said Arthur. Rarch, screeched the pterodactyl. Grrrg, agreed the seven-toed sloth. They must be thinking of the Ostend hoverport, muttered Arthur. He turned back to the girl. Have you ever been to Belgium, in fact? He asked brightly, and she nearly hit him. I think, she said, restraining herself, that you should restrict that sort of remark to something artistic. You sound as if I just said something unspeakably rude. You did. In today's modern galaxy, there is, of course, very little still held to be unspeakable. Many words and expressions which only a matter of decades ago were considered so distastefully explicit that, were they merely to be breathed in public, the perpetrator would be shunned, barred from polite society, and in extreme cases shot through the lungs, are now thought to be very healthy and proper, and their use in everyday speech and writing is seen as evidence of a well-adjusted, relaxed, and totally unredacted up personality. So, for instance, when in a recent national speech, the financial minister of the Royal World Estate of Quilla Vista actually dared to say that due to one thing and another, and the fact that no one had made any food for a while, and the king seemed to have died, and most of the population had been on holiday now for over 3 years, the economy was now in what he called one juju flop situation. Everyone was so pleased that he felt able to come out and say it that they quite failed to note that their entire 5,000-year-old civilization had just collapsed overnight. But even though words like juju flop, swat, and turlingdrome are now perfectly acceptable in common usage, there is one word that is still beyond the pale. The concept it embodies is so revolting that the publication or broadcast of the word is utterly forbidden in all parts of the galaxy, except for the use in serious screenplays. There is also, or was, one planet where they didn't know what it meant, the stupid turlingdrome. I see, said Arthur, who didn't. So, what do you get for using the name of a perfectly innocent, if slightly dull European country gratuitously in a serious screenplay? A Rory, said the girl. It's just a small silver thing set on a large black base. What did you say? I didn't say anything. I was just about to ask what the silver... Oh, I thought you said whop. Said what? Whop. That's probably it for today.